First up is Nintendo laughing at Microsoft for trying to buy them. So it's been 20 years since the original Xbox was unveiled at 2001 CES. Bloomberg has done a pretty extensive oral history of how the console came into existence, so it's something worth checking out. But there's some pretty interesting nuggets in the story, including Microsoft pitching to buy Nintendo. And according to someone from Microsoft that was in the room, he said they were basically laughed out of the building. Before we join in the laughter, it's worth noting that Microsoft's pitch at the time was actually pretty good because Nintendo was lagging behind Sony when it came to hardware. What they wanted to do was create a joint venture where they offered the hardware and let Nintendo focus on software creation, which Microsoft acknowledged was their strength. It was also revealed that Microsoft tried to buy EA. They said no. Square, also a no. But they eventually bought Bungie and snagged the Halo franchise, which clearly became a cornerstone of the console. So guys, what do you guys think about this?
So I can start here. I have a couple thoughts. So timeline, which that's the first thing that I looked up when I saw this story. The Nintendo 64 launched in 1996, right? So I would say, you had Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Super Nintendo. Nintendo 64 was the first. Well, there's a Virtual Boy in there too. Nintendo 64 was the first big follow-up. That was still really good. You had the Game Boy Advance, and then the GameCube came out in 2001. So remember too, before this happened, Nintendo and Sony had a deal to release I think it was called the Nintendo PlayStation, right? There's prototypes. So they were partnering on a CD-based console. Nintendo, I think, was, they were excited to do that. So Microsoft enters in 2000 or 2001, like you said. Nintendo, I think, is already prepping the GameCube, which we know didn't do that great. I think there were some really good games on there, kind of like the Dreamcast. Like, we all love it, but it wasn't like a commercial success. Tony, I'm looking at you for the Dreamcast. I know you love the Dreamcast. So I think it's an interesting position where Nintendo was coming out of, where they already had that mishap with Sony and basically got embarrassed, left at the altar or whatever. They had the GameCube in production, and then Microsoft comes in that, like you were saying, is a hardware company and Nintendo being a software company. So I can see them hearing that pitch and just going, like, we've already been through this. Why in the world will we do that? And then the other thing I want to say is Nintendo's kind of always taken their own path, right? Well, I don't want to say always, because it was pretty similar up to the probably the GameCube. And then after that is when they really started focusing on the handhelds, right? They started focusing on the Nintendo DS. The Wii was obviously a huge success for them. But before the Wii came out, everybody was like, wow, Nintendo's on its way down. We don't know what they're going to do. So the thought that they could produce, I guess it would be third party or their first party titles for other consoles made a lot of sense because they were so good at the software end. So the Wii obviously changed that. We all know the story of all the units that they sold. The Wii U, I think, would have continued that, but they did such a poor job of naming it and marketing it, like we were talking about for the Xbox One, Xbox One X, Xbox Series X, One S, Series S. It's confusing. So nobody knew when they went to go buy the new Nintendo system. It's like a Wii U, and they're like, well, I know the Wii. Everybody knew the Wii. That was one of the first mainstream consoles. So I don't know. It's just interesting, Nintendo's path, and they kind of carved out this niche with their first party titles. But you see people walking around, whether you talk to people that are playing and oh my God, I'm blanking on it, the new console for Nintendo.
Switch.
The Switch. They're playing the Switch and they're playing Pokemon. They're playing Breath of the Wild. They're playing Super Mario Odyssey. I know there's some other ones, but everybody that I talk to now, they're like, oh yeah, I'm playing Pokemon. So I think that's a really interesting story, but it's been interesting how Nintendo's been able to have so much success in that market.
So I think one of the things that's interesting too that you comment about Nintendo is they do like to go their own way. Nintendo reminds me quite a bit about Apple. And so if you look at the way when Apple came up versus Microsoft, Apple is very much about a closed system. They want the hardware and the software closed, right? They're not about licensing and distributing it across different platforms. Microsoft was the opposite, right? Their business model was actually very open. Our software can go on any kind of hardware. So it's interesting that was their mentality. It makes sense while they would approach Nintendo. But I think what they underestimated was Nintendo's mindset, similar to Apple's, which is that to them, it was that closed architecture system. I want control of the hardware and the software. And that's how, we know that our games are going to be done and played the way we want. They want it on their controllers and their setup, whether it was the Wii U, whether it was the Switch. Like they have a specific experience in mind. that includes both the hardware and the software. So, I think my respect for Nintendo has grown over the years, and I've come to better understand their philosophy and their mindset, because I used to be more of in the Microsoft's camp, where I wish that they would have just created Mario for some of these more advanced systems. But you got to respect their commitment to their model, and it's hard to argue with some of the success that they've had, for sure. Tony, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I just got a few, really. I mean, so I'm going to look at it more from just, you guys have always been super into games, super into consoles, super into the news on it, and like all the facts and stuff. And that's like, I usually wait for y'all to start talking, and then I kind of jump in because I'm like, oh yeah, I'll piggyback on that or whatever. But the first thing that came to my mind, this may not have anything to do with it, was just how much I had heard. Like I watched a few documentaries about it. And I remember, it was in the news and all things like that, was when they allowed another company to have access to Mario to make that movie, right? Like it was just a shit show. The movie was horrible.
Now
like
you're talking
basically,
about, just to clarify, you're talking about the Mario Brothers movie.
Yeah, the Mario Brothers movie with John
right.
Leguizamo and Bob Hoskins. So I remember in one of the documentaries, and it might have been just like a YouTube special that someone did on their own, they were basically saying how like Nintendo, the creator of Mario, after that was like, we are never going to work with any other company ever again. So to see, to imagine Microsoft coming in to, I would guess this may be super stereotypical, but I would guess that meeting took place in Japan. I don't know, maybe not. To take over or to ask if they could acquire them, being laughed out of the building. Yeah, that seems about right. They've made that mistake before of partnering up with another company and letting someone have rights to one of their most precious character ever, just the way I'm sure Xbox feels about Master Chief, things like that. Yeah, I could see that happening, being laughed at. That would suck. But I mean, I've always been a fan of Nintendo. There was a few years when I got into Xbox and PS2 and things like that, where I was like, man, I wish they would just come out with something that could compete with this. Because at the time I felt like they were lacking a little bit. But I mean, my girls, they love the Switch. I mean, I can't, every time I come and play with Warzone with y'all, I mean, they're playing Pokemon, they're playing Animal Crossing. Some other little game with like a little guy that just rolls around and sticks to walls and things like that Tish is like obsessed with. Like she got mad we were laying in bed and I was watching something and like she just like slammed something down and like rolled over and turned the light off, and I was like, oh God, what did I do? And it was just because she couldn't get past a level. Yep. And it's cool to see that, that passion for a Nintendo game again from someone in my family.
Their games are accessible, so they appeal to a broader audience, right? So when somebody picks up an Xbox controller, there's so many buttons, and I know Nintendo they've added more buttons, but just the Nintendo games to me have always been a little bit more simple. So for somebody that's not a hardcore gamer, they can pick up a Switch or a Wii, with the Wiimote. I mean, that was a huge deal, right? Wii Sports, how fun was that? So I think it's a lot more accessible for people. And that's something that Nintendo's done a really good job at.
So the other thing that they do, and we can kind of bring this to a close, but the one last comment I was going to make, Trey, is that I think they use their software to also introduce audiences to the hardware. So if you think about the Mario games, each generation of Nintendo hardware, there's always a Mario game, and that Mario game, the platform, you go back to Mario 64 on the N64, right? It showed off the 3D capabilities of that platform. You look at the Marios that came out on the Wii U versus the Switch. They show, basically what the graphics are capable of, and then how it's supposed to integrate really naturally. So I think Nintendo probably does a better job of that than almost, any company, to be honest with you. Leveraging the intellectual property, the characters, the games, evolving those games in ways that are quality, but then also leveraging the strengths of the new hardware to really kind of showcase what it can do. So Nintendo still really does excel at that. So it'll be interesting to see where they go, especially now post-Switch, as you start to see the Xbox Series X, the PS5 being as powerful as they are.
Well, so and think about the DS and the 3DS. Like, I mean, the Switch, we think about it as a portable game system, and it is, but it's also the main one when they still have the handhelds that are going. I mean, people still buy Game Boys.
Yeah.
It's great. It's amazing.
GoldenEye.
Hey,
Best game ever. Best game ever.
GoldenEye
One of the
and
best
Mario
games
64. Mario 64 and
10,
GoldenEye
IGN
are
10.
what would you rate that, Chris, on the IGN scale? No, those
10.
are two of the most revolutionary games. I mean, obviously Halo kind of changed the first-person shooter for the console. You got to give that to Wolfenstein or Doom overall, but
Doom, yeah. Doom and
yeah, I
Wolfenstein.
mean that was game changer. Duke Nukem a little bit also, but just those games on the Nintendo 64 were so revolutionary. We had never seen anything like that.
So Mario on the N64, the Japanese version gets a 10. So I had the N64 out of Japan and the Mario 64 out of Japan. So there was no English instructions whatsoever. So things that were pretty straightforward when you're playing the US version of the game, you had to completely figure out to get all the stars. I mean, so that was it was an amazing experience. That would have been a 10.
There was
All right, so let's bring
There was no internet when we played that either. Sorry.
No, not really. All right, so let's bring this conversation to a close, and let's transition now into the next segment, which is really around just the next gen hardware. It's selling out everywhere.